Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's session, Indian European Perspectives on the Iran War. My name is Jochen Luckschat, and I'm the director of the New Delhi office of Heinrich Böll Foundation. And I'm glad that we could pull this together with the Council for Strategic and Defense Research here in Delhi at rather short notice. We are meeting at a time when events in the Middle East are still evolving and rapidly so, and when many of us are trying to make sense of the more immediate but also longer term risks and implications of what's happening. It's important to remember that this conflict is unfolding in a global context that was already undergoing profound change. Even before the current escalation, we were witnessing a growing questioning of the rules-based international order, geopolitical rivalry, and mounting pressure on multilateral institutions. The recent military strikes by Israel and the United States on targets in Iran and the subsequent escalation between the parties involved have raised serious concern about a regional escalation, energy security, and the stability of global supply chains. At the same time, these developments also add another layer of uncertainty and complexity to an international system that, as I described it already, is in flux, prompting governments around the world to reassess their diplomatic positioning and strategic priorities. For India and Europe, the stakes are significant. Both are deeply connected to the region, historically, economically, politically, and through security considerations. At the same time, their respective historical experiences, strategic interests, and diplomatic traditions can sometimes also lead them to interpret developments in different ways. Understanding these different perspectives is especially important at a time when India-EU relations are deepening across a broad range of issues, from trade to technology to security cooperation. So today's discussion is meant to explore precisely these questions: how India and Germany or / Europe more broadly are interpreting the current conflict, what informs the respective positions, and where do assessments converge and diverge. And ultimately, we also want to come to some conclusions of what are the implications of all of this potentially for the India-Europe relationship as it's deepening. Given how dynamic the situation remains, today's exchange is less about definitive answers. It's more about sharing informed perspectives at a critical moment and as things are developing. I'm therefore very grateful for our speakers who have agreed to join us here today at very short notice, and for contributing their insights and expertise. And with that, I look forward to an interesting conversation, and I hand over to Devika from the CSDR. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Jochen. Hi, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon. My name is Devika, and I am from the Council for Strategic and Defense Research. And I would also like to welcome you all on behalf of CSDR. I just want to make a quick introduction. CSDR is, for those of us who are joining for the first time today, CSDR is a New Delhi-based think tank providing strategic analysis and policy recommendations to governments, businesses, and institutions. And our expertise covers a diverse gamut of issues from foreign policy, geopolitical risk, defense and aerospace, to climate change, peace building, and tech policy, to name a few. And we focus our regional expertise on the Indian subcontinent, Eurasia, and the Indo-Pacific. As always, we are delighted to host this webinar with HBS, and albeit under significantly more sobering circumstances. And yes, today's webinar, India-Europe Perspectives on the Iran War, brings together converging and diverging differing points from our regions as befitting a deepening bilateral partnership, and to foster greater understanding of each other's sensitivities as well. So to quickly kick things off, let me introduce our speakers. We have Ambassador Gadam Dharmendra, who is currently a non-resident senior fellow at Carnegie, India, and was formerly India's ambassador to Iran and High Commissioner to Zambia. And he retired as the Dean of the Sushma Swaraj Institute of Foreign Service here. Welcome, Ambassador Dharmendra. We also have Mr. Baumann, who's a Senior Program Officer for Israel, Palestine, Jordan, and Iran, Middle East and North Africa Division at the Heinrich Stiftung, Berlin, and he was formerly Desk Officer in the Afghanistan-Pakistan Task Force at the German Federal Foreign Office. Welcome, Mr. Baumann. And finally, we have a moderator, Professor Happymon Jacob, who's the founder and director of CSDR and a distinguished visiting professor at Shivnadar University. Welcome, Dr. Jacob. Quick housekeeping notes from my end. I request our panelists to keep their opening remarks to about 7 minutes. Post the opening session and the moderated discussion, we will open the floor for questions from our attendees. Please use the Q&A box to raise your questions for the moderator's consideration. That's all from me now. I will hand over the proceedings to Dr. Jacob. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Devika. Thank you, Joshan, for collaborating with CSDR on this important discussion at this point of time, which, as Devika pointed out, is clearly not a very hopeful time. We have been having several conversations, but I think this is one of those conversations which we realize is an important one, but will have implications going forward for our region and beyond. Before I hand it over to the two distinguished speakers, I want to sort of make very quickly 2 or 3 points. I think it's clear to all of us that what was supposed to be a quick war is not showing any signs of ending. At least this is the 19th day of the war since it has started. I think the longer it lasts, I think the more pronounced the impact will be for the region and beyond. I think the Iran war, which in my opinion is an illegal war, an unjustified one at that, would have long-term implications for the Indo-Pacific. I think that is one space where Europe and India have common interests, the Indo-Pacific. I think it's not just a problem for India when the Americans sank Iris Dana in the Indian Ocean immediately after a joint exercise with the Indian side. I think it not only diminishes, there's been a lot of argument within India that it diminishes India's security role in the Indian Ocean. That while that is accurate, I think the impact of this particular act on the Quad, on the Indo-Pacific as a strategic construct, and our own understanding of a non-militarized maritime space based on free and open Indo-Pacific as it were. I think all of that is going to take a hit given the manner in which the Americans acted in the Indian Ocean region. So I think this is something that's going to be of importance to both the Europeans and the Indians. We have been in the last few years talking about the possibility of more cooperation and collaboration between the two sides in the Indo-Pacific. I think, and let me be honest about it. I think one of the reasons why we wanted to have this conversation between the two sides is also because there was the fear of China, China becoming a major actor in the Indian Ocean region, and therefore, when Quad was put together, or when the American-led initiatives became prominent in the region, we thought this was going to be for more stability and for more peaceful interaction within the Indo-Pacific. It appears that this act has the ability to somehow create troubles for the possibility of any such conversation going forward, number one. Secondly, I think, and I don't need to also tell this group, that it has severe implications for energy security in the region and beyond. This is something that I think is being felt in our own households, right? I mean, the fact that we are unable to, or will soon be unable to get access to sufficient cooking gas, I think is a direct implication of this. The manner in which energy fields are being destroyed in the Middle East, in Iran and in its neighboring countries, will mean that it will take several years for the reconstruction to take place and to go back to where we were before, say, 19 days ago. But I think beyond the damage, it also indicates the deep instability and uncertainty pertaining to one of the most sensitive items affecting our daily lives, which is energy. Once the energy prices go up, prices for everything else tend to go up. So that is one aspect of the energy issue. I think the second aspect, at least from an Indian point of view, is that while reports indicate that Iran has or will be, Ambassador Gautam can come in on that, allow India to use the Strait of Hormuz to transfer energy to Indian shores. And the Americans have allowed India to buy oil from Russia, which they had asked us not to buy not too long ago, with 25% tariffs on India, etc. While this is of course a piece of good news, two pieces of good news, but I would say, to be honest, these concessions also put in the right perspective is a liability in the longer run, because you're looking at your energy security being a victim of the geopolitical calculations made in somebody else's capitals. First it was Venezuela, and then it was Russia. Now it is Iran. You don't know which direction this is going to go. So that also, I think, creates deep uncertainty, economic uncertainty with geopolitical implications as well. The third quick point that I want to highlight is that this war will definitely have implications for international law norms, and it will create unhealthy precedents for other opportunistic powers seeking to make such interventions in future. And I do have China in mind when I say that. European powers and India have in the past talked about the need to create a stable world order, to have discussions to ensure that there is multilateralism, and the institutions of that multilateral order are sort of kept intact, and global commons are taken care of, etc. So I think in a world such as this, where there is very little respect for norms and international law, we may not even be able to begin a serious conversation on multilateralism, on global commons and institutions thereof. And my final point is about the unpredictability of the United States as a partner for both Europe and India. I don't want to speak for Europe, and Bao can, of course, come in on that. But from an Indian point of view, I would say that for a very long time, the Indians viewed the United States of America as not necessarily as a partner in our continental neighborhood, be it in Pakistan, Afghanistan, or in the rest of the South Asian neighborhood. We always looked at the Americans as having a certain strategic agenda of their own, and not necessarily always as a partner. But we looked at the Americans as a natural partner in the Indo-Pacific, with Quad and the IPAF and various other supply chain initiatives. There was a feeling that while we may not have the convergence of interests in the continental space, we would have convergence of interest in the maritime space. I think the fact that the Americans have gone about doing what they have done unilaterally and sort of damaged the reputation of Quad or other maritime partners shows us that the United States of America is going to be a challenge for India, both in the continental space and the maritime space. Even for Europeans, for that matter, I guess the fact that the American intervention in Iran is continuing as it is, will definitely mean that there is going to be an attention away from Ukraine. You can't also rule out the possibility of another refugee crisis. So I think it's an opportune time for both our sides to sort of look at the long-term implications of this war from various dimensions. So keeping this in mind, may I invite Ambassador Gautam Dharmendra for his initial remarks, 7 to 8 minutes. Over to you, Gautam Saab.
Thank you, Professor Jacob, and thanks to CSDR and HPS for inviting me. I think happy you've covered a lot of ground in your opening comments, so that makes our job a little easier. Also, we are now towards the end of Ramadan. This war started at the outset of Ramadan. I think tomorrow, if the moon sighting is there, we'll have a happy Eid. And also day after is the Iranian New Year, Nowruz, 21st March. This will not be the first time that Iranians will be spending their New Year, a celebratory time, onset of spring, end of a cold, long, dark winter. They've done this for 8 years during the Iran-Iraq war. So we'll have to keep that history in mind and understand how the military dimension of this war is panning out. And then I'll close with the political side. So start with, I think the Iranians have gamed this war. Unlike the June war of last year, they have planned out multiple scenarios, and they have planned for a war of attrition. So like you said, early quick decapitation strike, an early in and an early out, quick exit, clean strikes. I think the Iranians were determined to deny that to them. Connected to that is both in June last year and in February this year, the military attacks from Israel and United States took place in the middle of talks. Do keep in mind, Omani foreign minister was very upbeat and very positive about the talks in Geneva. And these were to be followed by technical talks in Vienna when the decision was made to strike. So far, Iran's attrition strategy has been playing out. They have launched almost 60 waves of strikes. And rather than confine the strikes just to Israel, they have now attacked almost all the bases and civilian structures in the Gulf countries, and Azerbaijan and Cyprus. So that brings Europe directly into play. Cyprus is not a member of NATO, it's a member of the EU. We have this situation. Now, in terms of survivability, the Iranians have absorbed enormous amount of blows. The aerial bombardment of Iran has been unprecedented. Against all expectations, the Iranians have survived that. Now they have shown that they are willing to escalate and escalate, as we saw overnight, taking down energy structures in response to the attack on the South Pars gas field. More on that later. We can discuss that when we talk about the Hormuz. Iran has taken a counter value strike to overcome its counter force weakness. So that's one thing. Targeting energy centers across the region, compelling Saudis to turn to their Red Sea outlet for exports. Related to that is two aspects which have not happened. One, there are multiple other wars taking place in the neighborhood. The Hezbollah has attacked Israel and vice versa. The pro-Iran militias in Iraq have been attacking targets in Erbil, as also the US Embassy in Baghdad. The one surprise actor missing in this is Yemen. The Ansarullah of Yemen have not yet stepped in. So we'll have to see where that will go and when they will come in. So these pro-Iranian militias are there. Is Yemen being kept in reserve by the Iranians for a deployment later on during the war? We'll have to wait and see. 3 weeks into the war, Iran politically has survived. Expectations that there will be a regime collapse or a regime implosion have not materialized. We have multiple layers of leaders who've come in despite targeted assassination of all top-level leaders by the Israelis. We've lost Supreme Leader Khamenei at the beginning of the war, and yesterday we lost the intelligence minister Ismail Khatib. So we also lost Ali Larijani, a pragmatic leader who could have helped with the transition from war to peacetime. So we've lost multiple levels of leaders. What has then happened is this leadership decapitation has brought back into play a range of hardliners. We have Mohsen Razai, who's now heading the IRGC. We have Speaker of the Majlis, Bagher Khalilbaf, well-known hardliner, former commander in the Revolutionary Guards Corps. So we are seeing a situation and an evolution into a scenario and a landscape where we'll see greater radicalization of Iranian politics. That's one assessment. I hope I'm wrong, but the kind of leaders who are coming up, the kind of history they have, keep in mind, almost all of them are veterans of the Iraq War. They know how to give a war of attrition. They know how to preserve their strategic assets. So we saw from a peak launch of ballistic missiles and drones in the first days of the war, there was a slowdown. Again, we now see an escalation. Again, missiles are being used, drones are being deployed. So there is a two-step strategy. Last this out for as long as possible and preserve your inventory, your counterforce inventories. I think the Iranians have done that successfully, having learned from the Iraq war, and now all the Iraq veterans are back in play. Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei, not much is known about him except for speculation. He kept a very, very low profile. But reports of him from almost all sections universally are that he's an hardliner. And that, again, does not augur well. A word about Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who is now deceased. Along with him, the fatwa he issued against no nuclear weapons will also expire. Do keep in mind that a fatwa is valid for the period of the person who's issued that fatwa. It does not continue indefinitely. So with Khamenei's loss, we'll have to see whether there will be a reorientation of strategic doctrines in Iran. Expectations are 50-50. We do not know. We know that their nuclear program has been destroyed. A couple of days ago, Foreign Minister Arakchi, when asked about the 440 kgs of highly enriched uranium, 60% enriched uranium, said categorically that it is under rubble. If that be the case, will they be able to, if a change in doctrine is mandated by the new Supreme Leader, will there be a restart of the nuclear program, and what will then be the timelines for a breakout? They can be quite long, given that the centrifuges, highly sensitive equipment, are also under rubble. So this is where we are at this time. But given last night's incidents of the developments in the Pars gas field and the counter response on the Ras Lanan gas facility in Qatar, we are seeing an escalation where, from a purely military point of view, we are now moving into economic targeting. That does not augur well, both immediately for the region and for the rest of the world. So economic dimensions, Professor Jacob has already captured quite a few. I will add one part to that, along with gas and crude, which is fertilizers. A lot of fertilizers come from, or base is nitrogen and phosphorus for ammonia, DAP, and sulfuric acid. So we will see some food security shocks also. I will close by pointing out one unique geostrategic feature of the Hormuz Strait. We can continue that discussion a little later. It's one of the most unique choke points in the world. There is only one entrance and one exit from the straits, and the exit goes very close to the Iranian shores. So I'll stop there and then come back on the Hormuz and any follow-up questions. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Dharmendra. May I request Bog for your initial remarks, please?
Of course. Thank you for the invitation, and yeah, happy to be with you. I prepared a little input on especially the consequences for Europe. So Europe has been really caught off guard by the war, is ill prepared and unfortunately in a weak position. It is currently doing everything it can to make sure that this war won't become its own war, but at the same time it cannot really distance itself from the unfolding events in the Middle East, given the economic fallout and of course also the political consequences. For now, the economic impact of the war and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz is still manageable for Europe, since its imports, oil and gas imports from the Gulf countries are rather small for now. Still, the risk that this gets worse is really big, especially given the strikes from last night on the gas fields. But the strategic and political costs already looming at the horizon might be enormous for Europe. The alliance with the US is again at stake. International support for Ukraine might vanish. prolonged disruption of international shipping lanes would be a disaster for European economies. And of course, the scenario of protracted escalation and conflict in its eastern neighborhood in the Middle East fuels fears about terrorist attacks and another refugee crisis. So Europe faces multiple dilemmas with no easy fix at hand. I will just elaborate shortly on 4 of these dilemmata. So the first one would be the contesting assessments of the war within Europe. So while most European states agree with the main goals of the US-Israeli campaign, thus reducing military and nuclear capabilities of Iran and its proxies, and of course also weakening the ruling regime, which might lead to its fall eventually, but not sure. So they are fine with in general, but they are unhappy with the manner of the execution of this war, and of course the lack of strategy and prior consultation with Europe. So this dilemma plays out quite differently in the respective member states of EU and leads to very fractionalized positions on the war. So some European states, such as Spain, put the whole war into question, denouncing it as wrong means and breach of international law, even refusing to allow Americans to use their air bases in the country. Others, such as Germany, show rather solidarity with Israel and the US and only voicing very cautious criticism about the unclear strategy of Trump. So these different assessments of the war prevent a unified stance of Europe. And of course, this weakens Europe's leverage and unfortunately weakens as well the authority of international law in the long term, something that might fall back on Europe later and might hurt really. So the second dilemma I want to highlight is the already fragile relationship with the US that is now again under pressure. While most European countries feel, as I said, at unease with Trump's unilateral approach that has obviously no clear strategy, the EU member states are aware about their dependency on US military support and protection, especially in the case of Ukraine. And this leads to very cautious political navigation that oscillates between striving for independence from the US and, of course, also pandering President Trump. The thing is that in the worst case scenario, none of these goals will be achieved, neither independence from the US nor the desired support. And that is what makes this strategy a bit tragic. We see this dilemma very well when looking at Trump's request to NATO partners and other countries to support the US in opening militarily the Strait of Hormuz. Of course, this is no Article 5 case. It's not about defending the territory of a NATO member state. Therefore, the clear rejection of Trump's request from Berlin, Paris, London was just straightforward. However, I wonder if Europe will be able to uphold this position when the war continues and if the US will apply more pressure on its European partners. So if Europe wants to avoid a lose-lose situation that might only benefit Russia and its conquest of Ukraine, it needs to send a clear message to Washington, a unified message. The case of Greenland, for me at least, showed that this is indeed possible if there's an urgency. The third dilemma would be the lack of influence to shape things in the Middle East. Europe has a clear desire to de-escalate the conflict and to contribute to a settlement of the war. At the same time, it is faced with the growing lack of leverage and influence in the Middle East, which confines it a bit to the sidelines. So it is clear that aspirations and reality do not align. Europe must find a new role for itself in the region and probably also in the world if it does not want to fall by the wayside. So with its limited military capabilities and of course also the reluctance to use it, especially in the case of Germany, European states for a long time relied mostly on diplomatic channels and their own economic weight. But of course, its economic weight has shrunk. And given that all the possible sanctions against Iran have already been exhausted and many European states lost a lot of credibility in the Middle East following the Gaza war and their positioning on this war, the scope for exerting influence has become very limited, I would say. And this is as well true for the US and Israel, two close partners of Europe that have not even consulted the Europeans prior to the war. So Europe would need to deal with this new reality by really identifying what are their own interests and what are approaches that work better. And of course, by what you also said, Happy Moon, strengthening multilateral partnerships worldwide, such as with India and others, and to uphold a rules-based order. So the last dilemma I want to go in is a fossil dependency trap. So European states, of course, want to become more independent and less vulnerable economically, as probably many countries in the world, but they still depend heavily on oil and gas imports. I think it's a similar situation as in India. I mean, Europe does not depend so much on the imports from the Gulf, but from other countries. So the current crisis is yet another wake-up call for a speedy decarbonization, which is in the end the only sustainable way for reducing fossil dependencies from certain states, or in this case, from the fluctuating market prices. And given the urgency to find short-term fixes right now, Europe, I see it still struggling to go all in with this decarbonization of its consumption and industries. So for me, the closure of the Strait of Hormuz shows the vulnerability of these fossil supply chains. And I think it's important to notice that this is not necessarily an exception, but rather the rule. Oil and gas prices can fluctuate at any moment and expose the dependency of European economies. So the long-term answer would be clear for me. Renewable energies are energies of independence. But in the short term, European states might rush into new fossil dependencies, for example, from LNG gas from the US, or maybe even again from Russian oil, at least for some countries of the EU. And for me, this fossil dependency trap clearly indicates as well that the challenge is bigger than just opening up the Strait of Hormuz again. And just two sentences on the outlook, and then I'm done. So Europe remains largely a spectator for now, hoping for de-escalation of the conflict. But I think we shouldn't expect a miraculous resolution of the conflict or a quick fall of the regime in Iran. And that's also what my colleague just said. There are hardly any off-ramps right now in the short term for the US and the Iranian regime. The Iranian regime is really seeking to drag the war on, inflict as much costs as possible on everyone else. And Donald Trump will have a hard time to declare victory at any point soon. At the same time, he might be forced at some point to end the war due to domestic pressure. So Europe therefore needs to really invest into mitigating the immediate impacts of the war and at the same time strengthening international cooperation with other players worldwide and upholding international law. So thank you.
Thank you so much for those remarks, Bok. We have about 25 minutes for some conversation among ourselves. Let me sort of begin by a couple of questions for you, Ambassador Dharmendra. You spent time in Iran as India's ambassador. You've seen the country, you know the people, you know the ruling regime there. I'm quite curious. This is a country that has been under sanctions for such a long time. What explains the fact that they are putting up such a good fight in many ways against two of the strongest military powers that we have, one in the Middle East, of course, which is Israel, and the United States of America. What explains the resilience, the military resilience in Iran? That's my first question to you. The second question is, there was, I think, an expectation from the United States that, once there is a certain amount of, carpet bombing or decapitation of the leadership in Iran, the dissent that we saw in Iran, the protest that we saw in Iran would kick in, and there would be some impact on the ruling regime's ability to continue with the fight against the Americans and the Israelis. What happened to that, the protest movement? Has it been sidelined? Have they rallied behind the flag? What really happened? Over to you, Ambassador Dharmendra.
Thank you, Professor. Both very interesting questions, but in a way, they are also linked. I think one, how the country has survived almost 47, 48 years of quite punishing sanctions. You see, there we have two other examples. One is North Korea and the other is Myanmar. Neither could have survived without Chinese support. There was some kind of a godfatherly outreach for North Korea as also for Myanmar. Unlike those two, Iran is quite isolated, manages all by itself. So, what the Iranian response has been along multiple levels. First, we'll have to understand the socio-economic dimension. High literacy rates. We are looking at 85% of literacy across the country, both urban and rural. We can't just say urban literacy is X and rural literacy is minus X. There will obviously be a gap, but the gap is not significant. Very heavy investment in STEM, science, technology, maths. Absolutely fantastic universities. I have been to some of them, Sharif University, Tehran University. I've gone and engaged the children. Very bright, very, wanting to break out and be part of the world like their brethren in other countries, the Gen Zs and so on. There has been an economic autarky in the country where maximum pressure in terms of sanctions has led to a policy of maximum resilience. So you have multiple sectors of the economy which are really self-sufficient. So when we talk about Chabahar port not coming up to speed in terms of operations, the reason is also linked to Iran's self-sufficiency, whereby its foreign trade is limited to a few sectors. For instance, wheat, input for its steel, coke, all these sectors have been sanctioned by the Israelis. So we have an economy which is able to export, you will be surprised, to Afghanistan, to Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Iraq. In fact, Iraq's net electricity comes from Iran. Iraq concludes that trade in euros that has been permitted by the Americans so that Iraq does not collapse. So you have an economy which is self-sufficient in pharma, dairy products, construction materials, steel, and a very high rate of literacy, especially in their STEM research. That will explain how they've been able to reverse engineer missiles, drones, and supply these to other theaters, particularly to the Russians in Ukraine. So we have a situation where, because the US broke off diplomatic relations with Iran almost 45, 46 years ago, a lack of understanding of Iran's exact strengths, what Iran is all about, what the society is about, what the political culture is about, what has been the impact of the Iran-Iraq war, how did a revolution which was birthed or within its birth had to fight a war, how did it survive? And survive, it has. On the other question, one is the strategic depth of Iran is somehow underestimated. It's a natural fortress. To the north, you have this very high Alborz range. To the west, you have the Zagros Mountains. So any egress, people are talking about putting boots on the ground. You can't believe how difficult that country is. And we saw that in the failed rescue effort in Iraq by President Carter. And to the east, that's towards Afghanistan, it's all desert. So it's a very naturally fortified country. Now, I'll just close by talking about the society. There is deep, given the literacy rates, given how their exposure to the internet and to the world via Facebook and Instagram, there is deep frustration in the country with the regime's authoritarianism. Children want to break out. They want to interact with the rest of the world. They love watching Hindi movies and, singing Hindi songs in their homes and all. That has been evidenced by the frequency of anti-regime demonstrations. The last being in January, at which time the establishment was at its weakest and late Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei was at his most deeply unpopularity and hated, including by those who are nominally pro-regime. What these American and Israeli strikes have done is, first, Trump said we are locked and loaded. Then he said, help is on its way. I've heard from my friends in Tehran, whenever they've been able to have access to the internet, they said, what have the Americans done to us? Is this the help they promised to give us? Bombing hospitals, bombing schools, bombing banks. The people are in shock. The gap between the establishment and society has narrowed. What was once widening between the two sides has narrowed considerably. I mean, one is, of course, the rally around the flag syndrome, and Iranians, like Indians, are deeply, deeply nationalistic. But there is overall immense disappointment with the Americans. So I think I've tried to explain as well I can to your question.
That's brilliant. That is brilliant. Thank you so much. I think the explanation about how Iran survived this war, I think that's a great explanation. I haven't really come across something like this. Brilliant. Thank you so much. Bok, if I could come to you, what does the Iran war mean for European unity and NATO's own unity in that sense of the term? If I were to say that the Ukraine war in some ways united Europe, the Ukraine war in some ways also gave a sense of purpose and unity to NATO. Will the Iran war somehow weaken that? That's part one of my question. The second part is really, does it make sense for Europe to tell Trump that we will support American war efforts in Iran, provided he is willing to help with the Ukraine war against Russia? After all, the Ukrainians have offered to give drones to the American war efforts against Iran. Or that's not a quid pro quo that the Europeans are willing to make. Support for Iran in return for support for Ukraine. But generally about the European unity. Over to you, Bok.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And allow me just a small remark on the question to Gardem. Thank you I completely agree. And I would just mean this divide between large parts of society and the regime. It's difficult to assess right now because there is no really reliable polls, or it's difficult to access the country. But before the war, it was really like 80–90% of the population wanted this regime to go away, wanted another kind of governance, and many hated it very much. So for a long time, it was really this regime which kept basically the whole society hostage, and at the same time, invested so much in just its own survival. This might indeed change. I cannot tell how much this will change, but just saying that many people from the Iranian population are a little bit locked between the regime and the bombs from the Israelis and the US, not having any optimistic way out, which is quite tragic. Coming to your question, so indeed it's a big challenge for Europe to stay united. Actually, they aren't right now on this war. I have the little hope that at least for European countries, the more the crisis gets worse, there will be also a sense of urgency to get together and come to a joint stance on this war. At the same time, I don't really see a promising strategy to really impact things on the ground. I mean, what would be important is that at least vis-a-vis the US, there would be a clear stance. I mean, the threat is even bigger for NATO. I would say that the unity of NATO, which of course you could question also before, is there still like a unified NATO alliance that could have this deterrence of everyone is acting together if one member state is attacked? And now basically the biggest NATO state started this war. This is also something that I think one has to put on the table. And how are all the other NATO states dealing with this? I mean, I found it encouraging to see the clear rejection of Trump's request, which also shows a little bit, at least to a certain extent, how the US might get isolated by this move. At the same time, coming to your second question, I have no hopes that this transactional thinking, which normally everyone says Trump acts transactional, if Europe would help in the Strait of Hormuz, might bring the US or motivate the US to engage more on the Ukraine, that this won't work. I rather see this unpredictability that you mentioned in the beginning that is a heavy load for Europe, but for the whole world, and that it's not getting easier, but rather more complicated. And of course, for Ukraine, it's not just a matter of political will, but also equipment coming more rare, especially interceptors, which are already now moved from East Asia to the Middle East. And I mean, this is something where I feel that Russia and also China are observing, quite interested how you could deplete these interceptors quite easily with very cheap drones, and then they have to shoot this heavy interceptors. So I would say the only strategy is really that could work is that Europe getting their stuff together and concentrating on own strengths. And of course, for this, they need to invest a lot in military capabilities and, as I said, in diplomatic networks, multilateral order, because I feel that this is really dangerous. Now we are always talking, international order is over, it's a world of predators. But I mean, for now, it might be the right one to hit this Iranian regime, which broke all human rights records and so on. But the next time this might turn against us, and then we see how much, especially as not the biggest actors on the field, we rely on international rules.
If I could ask you a supplementary question on the feeling within Germany, what has been this sort of debate within Germany, in Berlin, within the political establishment on the Iran question? Remember, Germany was one of the key proponents of the JCPOA in some ways. I mean, they were the engine behind it. And of course, finally, that didn't take off thanks to Trump. Now, we've reached where we are. One of the reasons, in my opinion, is because we didn't sort of sustain that particular agreement. So what is the feeling within Germany? Is it in support of Trump's actions? Is it not in support? So where do you see that debate going?
It's very mixed. I would say if you ask like opinion polls in the broader population, I think most people would be against this war. Of course, if you listen to Friedrich Merz, he came out with a statement saying, basically, our diplomatic approach failed. This wait and see game didn't work out. So now might be the time for military action. It's shrugging the shoulders and saying, like, I don't know a better way out. But for me, I think there are merits of this JCPOA, which of course was quickly turned down by Trump in his first term, and then never worked again. So there was not really enough time to let this agreement work. Of course, it had loopholes, missiles were not included, proxies were not included. So it was far away from perfect, but saying that diplomatic means doesn't work, I think is just stupid. And of course, I feel that the atmosphere also changes a lot in Berlin, that you see by the day how also the statements of the German government get more critical towards the US engagement. At the same time, we are at the point where there's, as I said, there's hardly any good exit strategy, which makes it very difficult. And of course, Europe being locked in a position where, after now also listing the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard Corps, is, I mean, there's so little room for diplomatic maneuver as long as this regime, or like maybe an even more hardcore regime led directly by the Revolutionary Guard forces, how you could make diplomatic efforts. So for now, I do not really see a strategy for Europe to engage directly with Iran, rather someone that could support other countries in the region that are better placed, like maybe Oman, maybe Qatar, countries that could act as mediators.
Thank you. Ambassador Dharmendra, if I could come to you once more. What's been your take on the Indian reaction to the Iran war? Of course, the commentators are saying that this is a fine balancing act, but are we balancing enough? Will this balancing last? Can this balancing be sustained? What's your sense?
Given the equities we have in the Gulf, and our historical traditional relations with Iran, I think we are walking a fine line. We have managed to pull off that balancing so far quite comfortably. Challenges, of course. We have a huge diaspora in the Gulf countries, so we are directly invested in their safety and security. We have engaged the Iranians on multiple issues, particularly connectivity. And we are a net exporter of APIs for the pharma industry, rice, non-sanctioned items to Iran. So the relationship continues. I think that enabled us to persuade them to permit passage of some of our vessels, which we managed given the shortages creeping up now. We are all heading into a huge supply chain shock as LNG gas supplies from Qatar's Ras Ladan field dry up or slow down to a trickle. The world is going to feel the shocks. So I think so far we've managed. Coming days will be even more difficult. How will the Iranians be stopped from exercising a deterrent capability on the Hormuz, thereby escalating the war risk premium for commercial vessels? No shipping company, no maritime company wishes to take that risk, put their sailors in danger. So we're going to see huge supply side shocks. I think that we are just in the beginning of these escalations. I mean the supply chain difficulties, and of course that's directly related to escalations. If the Israelis persist on trying to draw the Gulf countries into a counter value exchange with Iran, the region will suffer huge setbacks. Particularly the Gulf countries, which have so far focused on their economic growth, promoted themselves as a safe haven for investments, residency for high net worth individuals, now leaping into a tech century. Tech platforms like Amazon Web Services, Meta, all the big companies are dropping anchor in Saudi Arabia and UAE, given the plentiful availability of energy. So I think, one, yes, to answer your question, I think we are walking a fine line, and the coming days and weeks and longer this goes on, which seems to be the intent of the Iranians, not the Americans. The Americans want out quickly. We're going to see multiple cascading effects. One, supply side shocks. So the global economy, this has gone intercontinental. A regional war has gone intercontinental. And we have to keep in mind there are two important elections coming up. One in Israel in October, and one in the US in November, the midterm elections. This developments, the longer this carries on, will have a forceful impact on those two events which are coming our way. Thanks.
Thank you. That's fascinating. I have a follow-up question for you, but before that, let me also let our participants know that if there are questions, please write your questions in the chat box here. We will then pick them up and give those questions to the panelists. But Gadam Sam, if I may ask you a follow-up question on that. We've been looking at many of these Middle Eastern cities as hyper cities in some ways. I mean, they were the rich and the powerful go there and settle down, and those cities suddenly have come under fire. There is deep uncertainty about what's going to happen to, say, for instance, the future of Dubai. People are trying to get out of that place. What does that mean for prosperity in the Middle East? What does that mean for the oil-rich countries that have been not only investing in oil infrastructure, but also AI and a lot of other things? What's going to happen to some of these countries? So far, it appears that they have not been going very hard against Iran. But if they decide to go hard against Iran, it's going to sort of deepen the divisions and the challenges. But so, what's your sort of forecast in terms of where these cities are headed in general, where the Gulf is headed in general?
I think we can safely conclude that this 2 decades of uninterrupted peace in West Asia is drawing to a close. The 6 GCC countries prospered I think given the events of the last couple of weeks, that prosperity will, I mean, they'll be able to rebuild, they'll be able to reconstruct. But the safety they offered to investments, to capital, to multinational companies to drop anchor, immense air connectivity network, I think those days will be drawing down to a close. There will be a shift. Honestly, it's been a relief so far. I don't know how long this will hold. But the GCC has not directly engaged the Iranians, except for even the ministerial meeting they had yesterday. Strong statements, but nothing in terms of action. They are so far refusing to make this into a GCC-Iran war, which will then enable the Americans to get out. I don't think they want to do that also. They're going to bind them down. But here, I think, Professor Jacob, I think we'll perhaps CSDR can do a topic on this, and I'll be more than happy to help. I think in this flight of capital, inversely, directly proportional to level of risk assessments, India has an opportunity. We should look at attracting and making Bombay, Visakhapatnam, Bangalore attractive propositions for capital. We already have a head start in terms of tech. I think we can do better. A related point is the Gulf is a net food importer. We are a net energy exporter. I think that has already been explored. I think those linkages can be deepened going forward. But definitely, yeah, long answer to your question is yes. Flight risk assessments for West Asia will be reevaluated. All the major multinationals will be assessing their exposure. And herein, we should explore whether we have an opportunity in India to attract that capital and that offer them safety.
Thank you. If I may take that question to Bok, what's your sense of what this is going to do to the Middle East, the Gulf countries, the rich countries in that region, in terms of their own prosperity, in terms of their own future options? It is not as if they don't have military power. They do have the military power. They're choosing not to use it. But despite having that military power, they are not immune from the crossfire that is happening at this point of time. So what's going to be the future of the Middle East? That's one part of the Gulf states. That's one part of it. The other is, do you see this? Do you see a danger of this war spreading if the GCC countries get involved, and if you have others sort of joining one way or the other, be it the Ukrainians sending their drones, or who knows, somebody else is going to sort of do something else. There is, of course, the Saudi-Pakistan defense pact. So a spread of this war, is that a likelihood that you're foreseeing at this point of time? Bok, over to you.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So indeed, I very much agree with Ambassador Gadam. It is very dangerous for Dubai, for Abu Dhabi and Doha, because it's not just about the security itself, but very much about the reputation. And I think for this reputation, it would be enough if there is once a month a drone going to Dubai, and I mean, this would prevent many investors and especially also tourists from going there, and this won't be easily restored. And depending on how much this Gulf states will need to invest to rebuild, this might also have effects on Europe, where, of course, countries from the Gulf, via their big funds, are invested in many companies. I think if, of course, they would be really in a need of funds, they would most likely withdraw funds also from the US and Europe, which also might create repercussions in these countries. And I think we haven't maybe realized how much stakeholders from the Gulf already own shares of European and American companies. So I think for their future, this will completely change, and it depends very much on how much this war will drag on or spread. And I see an imminent threat that this spreads. I mean, for the Gulf countries, I think the biggest fear is this more low intensity dragging on, which hampers economy. the real spread I rather see in Lebanon, Iraq, potentially again in Syria and in other places where this could lead to a real complete destabilization of the region, and where we, especially for Iraq, already see some militias aligned with Iran enter into attacking and then get attacked from the US again, or Iran attacking Kurdish forces in northern Iraq. And of course, this is quite dangerous for the reason for the region, for the countries. I mean, Lebanon could be, if this continues, be on the brink of a complete breakdown. And of course, in the European perspective, this is often talked about in terms of refugee flows that might be created through this event. But I mean, I find it also important because from Europe, we look very much, of course, at the security of Israel and their right to defend themselves from real threats. Of course, they have a right to defend themselves. At the same time, I feel that they are only putting everything on being militarily like dominant in the whole region, and on an approach that means security for Israel and insecurity for everyone else. But this won't be stable. So I think the only stable way could be to transform these military wins into some political agreements that are really stable. And I don't see any intention for now that the US or Israel is trying to transform their gains into political gains. And this is also a point where Europe should come in, because it's also not in our interest to support Israel further in a military forever war that won't end, because asymmetrically you don't need a lot of weapons to inflict pain with terror attacks. And this is something you cannot control even by the best militaries in the world.
Bok, if I could ask an additional question, which is, do you see a lot of Europeans seeing themselves in some kind of a difficult spot here? Many of you may not necessarily like this war, the way this war has been carried out, the way the decision to carry out this war was made. But on the other hand, you also don't want to see an America that is embarrassed. You may not want to really see an America that has lost a war in Iran, against Iran, because that would have implications for transatlantic relationships, that would have implications for European security architecture, that would embolden, say, Russia or China for that matter. So do you think there is this deep-seated dilemma in some ways in the European security calculation when it comes to the American war on Iran?
Yeah, I would completely agree. I mean, there is no good options. It's dilemmata, and this for me shows also that there is no clear positions. I mean, it's also something where back in 2003, when the US invaded Iraq, you had all these big demonstrations in European capitals, and for now you don't see this, but also because it's not so clear what is actually the demand that we have, or what do we want. Of course, we want somehow peace and that this is over, but as you said, there's no easy way. Of course, it would be devastating if Iran somehow wins, the regime survives and continues to terrorize the whole region through its proxies, and of course might embolden Russia and other things. This would be terrible. At the same time, there's also terrible scenarios for an forever war with boots on the ground, where the US and maybe then also European states get dragged into a war with no clear end game in sight. So it's conflicting, and I don't have a good answer, but I feel you see it on the level of the populations, where of course there's a big sentiment, this is an unjust war, we want it to end, but we don't have a quite like what's a good thing we could ask for. And on the level of decision makers, where I feel more and more cautious criticism, but I don't see this really. We stand up and walk in a certain direction. In this sense, also Europe is walking somehow a fine line, maybe different from India, but still struggling to find its role.
There is a question in the chat box about the possibility or limitations of a unified response by India and Europe on the Iran question. The exact question is, to what extent do India's strategic autonomy and Europe's transatlantic alignment limit a unified response to the Iran conflict. I think it may be a good idea to reflect broadly on the question of the limitations that exist on a unified response between India and Europe. Do we necessarily agree with each other on this war that is being conducted by the Americans and Israelis? Let me sort of start with you, Basa Dharmendra, if you could sort of throw some light on from the Indian point of view, and also if you'd like to reflect on the possibility of this unified response as it were.
I think about a week, 10 days ago, Jaishankar, External Affairs Minister, was in Europe. He had discussions with a range of his counterparts. I'm sure the situation in West Asia would have been discussed. But given the manner in which the United States went into this war, completely ignoring Europe, not just the war per se, but even in the nuclear negotiations. Do keep in mind the EU +1, Germany, were an integral part of the nuclear talks with Iran, alongside the Americans, and the P5+1, as they call themselves. I think there Europe has, as Bock mentioned, Europe has been sidelined quite effectively. So I think India, Europe, other than talking about a post-war scenarios, reconstruction, managing any change in security doctrines, what will then be the supply chain integrity. I think those are a couple of issues they can have meaningful discussions. But I think right now, in this situation of kinetic action flaring up in the region with escalation on economic targets, I think both sides will find maybe just to kind of watch, wait, and plan for the day after. I think the Americans have not planned for it, nor have the Israelis. I think this is where India and Europe can cooperate, particularly if it's energy security, supply chain security, and of course, monitoring of a change in region-wide security doctrines. And I really mean nuclear. Will Iran, after this experience, decide that the only way to secure itself is through a deterrent acquisition? We'll have to. I think those could be useful discussions with the Europeans.
Thank you, Bock. If I could take that question to you.
Yeah, I mean, I agree that indeed for Europe, the strong traditional alignment with the US hampers also efforts to redefine what is our strategic goal. And a little bit what I said, like it's a hope you could have everything at once, that you could somehow maintain the privileged relation with the US and build new strategies. But I feel that we had now more and more incidents where this logic comes to its end, or is stuck in the dead end, in a sense that as long as you are not coming to other maybe more flexible new terms with the US, it will be difficult to build up a known stance as European Union, or as Europe in partnership with other players around the globe. So this indeed is difficult, and of course there we see again that we have very different positioning on the importance of the European US alignment within Europe, where of course France has a different role, and of course traditionally also more strategic independence, if you want to say so, than maybe Germany, where this connection with the US is still valued higher, I would say. And of course, I would say it needs new corporations, new alignments with India, with other players around the world. At the same time, of course, this won't be easy, or it's not just coming natural. You also need to really identify where are the common interests, and I think in economic terms there are many common interests, as the latest agreement between India and the EU also shows. At the same time, when it comes to Ukraine, of course, there is a point of conflict where Europe is not happy that India can and is doing now, buying again Russian oil, which is of course not what Europe tries to do in isolating Russia, where you could, of course, put a question mark if this works or will work ever. But I see this as as a little stumbling stone also for getting closer right now, at least in this moment.
Thank you. There is an interesting question by one of the participants. How can India work with European partners to create contingency frameworks such as alternative routing, risk insurance, or multilateral guarantees that keep IMEC economically relevant even while the region remains volatile? Pastor Dharmendra, if I could take to you, talking about IMEC at this point of time is somewhat.
Yeah, I think we forgot to talk about IMEC. I'm glad the question was raised. Again, part of the answer I'd already given earlier, but on the main issue of going forward, it's useful for all of us to understand that there will be a reordering of the region, and which will have a cascading effect on the globe, as was raised in the question. Supply chains, maintaining them, their integrity, storage facilities, strategic reserve. How can we enhance our cooperation on strategic reserves, holdings, and so possible. More importantly, I think the day after we'll see a reevaluation of the Abraham Accords and the IMEC. We will have to prepare for a new approach, or maybe an altered approach from the principal participants in the region as to what exactly has been the value of Abraham Accords. That reevaluation will start in Bahrain and in Abu Dhabi, Emirates, the two other partners to the Abraham Accords. Related to that would be how vulnerable Haifa port is and how exposed some of the supply chains will be from which form part of the culmination point of the IMEC. So while the start could be Kandla or Kochi or wherever, the end will be Haifa and then onwards into the Mediterranean, whatever destinations. So I think, yes, there will be a reevaluation of that. And this is, again, linked to our working with the Europeans, were that to happen, what alternatives? Because the other choke point, Red Sea and Suez, has not yet come into play. If this war continues and the Houthis step in and start launching attacks, they still seem to be in reserve. Apparently it's a question of when and not if will they enter the fray on the side of Iran. So that again exposes the two choke points, vulnerability of Hormuz and vulnerability of Bab el-Mandab, Suez Canal. So again, these are agenda items for discussions.
Brilliant. Thank you. Bok, if you have any response to that, any reflections, thoughts on that?
I cannot really add on it. So I would basically completely agree that it needs really a re-evaluation of also approaches that we took for granted for a long time, and that might not work anymore. And I think it's a slow realization how this, might be a long war that really has a lasting impact and not just something that creates turmoil for some weeks and then we get back to the world how we had it before. Of course, I still hope that this is over quickly and we could go back somehow to some of the things we had before, but I'm afraid it won't.
Right. Ambassador Dharmendra, one more question for you about, I wanted to ask this question. I asked this question of Bok, but over to you. On the possibility of this war spreading, as someone who spent time in the region, how do you see the sort of what may be the thinking that's going on in the GCC on the potential spread of this war? That's one. When you talk about spreading of the war, it's not just physically, right? It's also the possibility of various other actors getting involved indirectly, not always directly. As I mentioned in my own introductory remarks, you're looking at the Indian Ocean as a theater getting affected by the war that's happening in the Middle East. So you're looking at various theaters coming together. You're looking at the implications for Europe, implications for the regions beyond the immediate theater of conflict. So directly and indirectly, what do you see in terms of how do you see in terms of this war getting let's say spreading beyond the confines of the theater at this point of time?
Well, we have already seen instances of fighting in Iraq, Lebanon, and but these two theaters. So the war has spread. It's of, I think, immense surprise to me, and quite happy surprise that the GCC has not yet entered the fray. If they do, then all bets are off. It's going to be quite bad, because then the Iranian strikes, which have been selective so far, could become much more aggressive. They've held back a lot of their high-end missiles and heavy missiles, so they are really managing their inventory. Do recall that the Iranians also sent drones into the Incirlik base in Turkey. It's a NATO base, it's an American base in Turkey. And they've launched a missile into Nakhchivan in Azerbaijan, the Azeri territory in Armenia, the Nakhchivan enclave. None of the actors have responded. Do remember that the Americans said, we will put boots on the ground. The Kurds in Iraq will go into Iran and help us to secure some of the facilities. The Kurds have not stepped in. The Azeris have not counterattacked Iran. The Turks have absorbed the strike. These were intercepted, and they've also stepped back, as have the GCC. So, despite provocations and counter-provocations, the principal actors to the conflict remain Iran on one side and Israel and US on the other side. That dynamic has not changed. Fortunately, we do not know whether the GCC will hold. There are clearly divisions within the GCC. How long will that hold? The Qataris have expelled some Iranian diplomats, military personnel serving in their embassy. Others have not done much. The Omanis have been the most vocal in saying this is an unwarranted, illegal war of choice. So I think we are fortunate it's not spread.
Right. Any thoughts on that, Bok? Or there is also another question that we could potentially look at as the last question. If major powers themselves violate sovereignty and the UN Charter, does international law still function as a, where did that go? Oh, right, yeah. As a constraint or merely as a political tool? What remains of the credibility and authenticity of international law? I think I should take that to Bok. You might want to sort of reflect a little bit over that question.
Yeah, we are in a quite critical phase. I would say that I mean it's not new that international law is under pressure, and of course it's also not new that we have seen breaches of international law all around the world, as well as from the US for decades. I think what is really new is that major actors like the US do not acknowledge international law any longer as a point of reference. I think this is really new, that before that we had at least a general agreement that the international law would be a joint reference while many actors were breaching this law. And now we are at a point where many actors are still breaching this international frameworks, but where major actors pull out and basically say it's no longer relevant to us. And of course, this brings us in a position where it's even more difficult to uphold it. And I feel that you cannot answer this question by is it still relevant, yes or no. But
Yeah.
I think it's more a question where, at least from a European perspective and from a perspective of many countries that are not strong superpowers, I would say out of necessity, this is the only way we must uphold these rights, even though we might not succeed, because as I said, like in a world where the law of the jungle is a rule, we won't have prosperity and economic gains because there is no rules for it, and basically then it will be the rules of the stronger guys, and we won't have security. So I think we sometimes have to remember what international law brought us in positive terms, and not just go ahead like it's an old-fashioned thing. Now we have to move on to other things, even though, of course, it's a problem that the United Nations, especially the Security Council, is, of course, dysfunctional with these veto powers that basically, yeah, make that you cannot, get votes from the Security Council on certain sensitive issues.
Thank you. Do you have a 30-second point on world order, international law, any of those grander questions, Ambassador Dharmendra? Or
Well, the world order is under strain. Whatever order we may think of, it's been under strain for definitely the last 5 years, post-Ukraine for certain. So what efforts are being made to get a global south together, given how geographically spread that concept and notion is? We are entering, I think that Bok answered a lot of it in his formulation on where we are on international law. So that kind of more or less explains the disorderly world order we are in right now.
right, thank you. I mean, I think we've come to the end of this discussion. I just want to leave you all with a couple of very quick points. One, I think both the participants, in some ways, directly or indirectly, touched upon the fact that the worst in this war has not yet come, and let's hope that we don't get to that stage. As both of you pointed out, I think many of the actors in the region are still sort of holding their fire, unwilling to add fuel to the fire, as it were, be it the Houthis or the GCC states or Turks for that matter. I think that's a good sign. I think nobody wants to see this spiraling out of control and sort of setting the entire region and beyond on fire. I think that's a good news from this in some ways. There's a lot of responsibility that we are seeing. There's a lot more restraint that we are seeing by a lot of actors in the region. I think that's the good news. I would also say that I think the other takeaway in some ways is that the dependence on oil and gas as energy sources will have inherent limitations going forward. If it is be it Suez Canal or the Strait of Hormuz, we are seeing those geopolitical difficulties playing into our ability to access energy. But I think there is then a blessing in disguise in some ways, right? I mean, the efforts at looking for alternative sources of energy, greener energy sources, I think that's already underway. I'm sure in the wake of this conflict, in the wake of this, a lot more countries will seriously put a lot more efforts into moving away from fossil fuels, as it were. I think that's my second takeaway. If I were to be thinking about it, I would say, hey, this is an opportunity. We've seen how this works. We don't want to run out of gas in my kitchen. So how do you go about doing this? You'll plan for alternative energy sources. On the other point that I want to sort of highlight is the question of the importance of international law, the importance of order, the importance of institutions, as it were, which both I think Europe and India are in some ways concerned about. I think the difficulty, apologies, the difficulty comes when the difficulty is because I think we have differing views in some ways on what can sustain the rule of law, what can sustain the international institutions, what can sustain global order. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, Bob, but I think my own sense is that from a European point of view, the United States is key and fundamental to any conversation on global order, international institutions, etc. I think Europe probably hasn't yet reached a stage where they are willing to consider global order conversations without having the United States somewhere in that room, one way or the other. But I think from an Indian point of view, I would say while we recognize the United States as an important partner and as perhaps the leader of the global order and institutions set up in the wake of the Second World War, I think there's a lot more willingness in India to have conversations about global order without the United States being the key actor, key player, in that room. I think we are able to look at alternative mechanisms. I don't want to say BRICS because BRICS is going to be in some trouble this year thanks to the war in the Middle East. And my final point really is about there are some questions about how can Europe and India come together? The middle powers are situated, what alternative frameworks or mechanisms that they can put together. I think there is an opportunity right there. The reality is that in a world with declining multilateralism, in a world with instability and uncertainty, you will need like-minded partners who have, of course, their own respective vulnerabilities, but are willing to trust each other on very clinical, very specific issues. I think that conversation has already started between India and Europe. In the last 2 to 3 years, we've seen a spike in that conversation in the context of trade, in the context of security, in the context of defense, in the context of energy. I think that conversation is definitely going in the right direction. And I think these two countries will have to, my apologies, these two sides will have to continue that conversation in sort of ensuring that the external shocks do not affect us beyond a point. With these remarks, I may thank the two panelists, Ambassador Ganandhar Mendra and Bok Bowman, and the Heinrich Böll Foundation for putting this together, and to our participants for joining in this conversation. But back to you, Devika, for the last word.
Hi, thank you, sir. Amazing discussion as always, and very timely. I want to thank our panelists and our attendees for joining us today and for your questions. And yeah, I would like to thank HPS for collaborating with us on this occasion. We cannot emphasize enough on the importance of bringing together these diverse perspectives, even as we have been working on the India-Europe bilateral relationship and its multiple facets. So yeah, we look forward to continuing and fostering dialogues to ensure these perspectives are brought together time and again together. So once again, thank you, Professor Jacob, and thank you, Ambassador Dharmendra and Mr. Bowman. Thank you, Okan. Yeah, hope you all have a great day.
Thank you.